Welcome everyone, and today we are going to be talking about film noir. We're going to be talking about icons, which is the kind of symbols and objects and things that you see in film noir. We'll be talking about archetypes, which is the kind of people and characters that you see. And we'll talk about rituals, which is sort of the things that happen typically in film noir. And then we will also be exploring some of the styles and the things that kind of aesthetically make film noir. So let's get started. First of all, we need to sort of explain what film noir is. How's it been described? Roger Ebert, the celebrated film critic, once said, "A film noir film is a movie which at no time misleads you into thinking that there is going to be a happy ending." And this is one of the key elements that we need to know about film noir. Few, if any, of the artists in Hollywood who made noir films even called them noir at the time, and that's something that's very interesting because even though film noir is sort of referred to as a film genre, much like comedy, western, musical drama, it's not really a genre. It's a style of film. And the terminology itself didn't emerge until after the era of film noir came and went. The Film Noir Foundation once said that the vivid commingling of lost existence, doomed romanticism, desperate desire, and shadowy sexuality in those immediate post-war years proved hugely influential. And what this means is that those post-war years, after World War II, which is when the noir kind of era began, it was a really difficult, dark time. People were desperate. We'd just come out of a depression and then a world war, and the economy was trying to get back onto its feet, and people were kind of awakening to this new post-war world where kind of the perfection of the perceived world was no longer shimmering and shining. War and depression have a way of doing that to you. So where did it all start? First of all, film noir literally means black film. Of course, it's French, and it refers to the dark themes, the tones, and even the cinematic lighting that was used. So not just the elements of story, but the elements of style as well. It's also the style of film, again, that was popular in the early 1940s, and it lasted well into the late 1950s, a little bit into the 60s, and then we saw little dribs and drabs of it kind of pop up now and again from that point right through until present day. Before film, noir was actually found in pulp fiction literature, which is sort of where all of these kinds of stories originated. They showed up in dime store novels and pulp magazines, and this was kind of bottom barrel sort of common denominator writing. So literature in the kind of academic terminology doesn't really apply. But they did come out in these little dime store novels, and they were called dime store novels because they were literally like 10 cents pulp magazines where they would have serialized stories and things like that. Nearly 20% of film noir films between 1941 and 1948 were actually adaptations of the hard-boiled detective fiction that we were just talking about. And again, this visual style, the dark and gloomy kind of shadowy style that came to define film noir actually comes from earlier cinema, particularly the German Expressionism era. And if you ever watch a movie like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Metropolis, you'll see that they're dark and grim and moody and express kind of really sort of negative, unhappy sort of stories and visuals and things like that. And these are all the same kind of things that we see in film noir. And again, as I've already said, it does reflect this grim reality, the difficult days that came after World War II. A lot of guys came home, they didn't have money, they didn't have jobs, sometimes they didn't have the families that they left behind or their sweetheart who they planned to marry once they got home. They came back to discover that she'd married someone else or was in love with someone else, and they didn't always come back to the hero's welcome, and much of what they left behind was no longer there, and that led to a lot of depression and desolation, and they kind of wandered around for a little while, and they were really kind of beat up and depressed, and it was a difficult time for them. Very often these films were very low budget. They would recycle sets and props and costumes, actors and actresses. Now, because of film noir, some of these actors became household names. And these are names that you're going to recognize. Humphrey Bogart, Robert Mitchum, Fred MacMurray, Burt Lancaster, John Garfield, Alan Ladd, This is only a half dozen of a great number of actors who went on to critical acclaim, but who got their start in these low-budget, cheap kind of dime store thrillers that we're talking about. So what are some of the famous adaptations in film noir? I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll go through some of the most popular ones. The Maltese Falcon in 1941. This was adapted from Dashiell Hammett's 1929 detective novel of the same name, The Maltese Falcon. But it was first published as a serial in Black Mask magazine, and that's again one of those pulp magazines that I was talking about a few minutes ago. This was the film debut not of Bogart himself, but of his famous film detective Sam Spade. He became a character in literature, he became a character on the radio, and certainly in film. And The Maltese Falcon is often considered one of the first true film noir film. It co-starred Mary Astor as the Femme Fatale, which we will talk about shortly, and Sidney Greenstreet, who was a fairly acclaimed actor actually, as the Fat Man. Creepy film star Peter Lorre, who went on to work in a lot of creepy sort of thrillers and horror movies, early horror movies of the time. He played the villainous, but sometimes kind of played for laughs too, Joel Cairo. Interestingly enough, The Maltese Falcon in 1941 wasn't the first time that this story was adapted. In fact, it was done twice before, in 1931 and again in 1936, but this one is the one that comes closest to Hammett's novel. And again, it is considered a masterpiece in filmmaking. Double Indemnity came out in 1944. This was adapted from a James M. Cain novella, which was published in 1943. And again, much like the previous film, it was first published as a serial in Liberty magazine way back in 1936. And it was inspired by a real-life case in 1927 about a woman who put out an insurance policy on her husband, a life insurance policy, and then plotted to murder him. Again, the film was released in 1944, and it stars Fred MacMurray as insurance salesman Walter Neff. And what makes this interesting about Fred MacMurray is that he was actually considered a very wholesome actor. But in Double Indemnity, he was something else entirely. He was an insurance broker, or an insurance salesman rather, who was lured into a world of murder and deceit by Barbara Stanwyck, who plays our Femme Fatale, and Edward G. Robinson, who was and continues to be even today one of the quintessential names in these kind of gritty sort of detective and police stories and things like that. Not to say he didn't do other films, of course, but this was certainly really where he stood out. The author, James M. Cain, loved this film, and even though, as happens typically when adaptations from novels are turned into films, changes get made, this is one of the very few where the author actually liked the film version more than they liked the actual words that they themselves had written. Similar to the other film, this is considered one of the first and one of the best film noir films. 1946 brought us The Postman Always Rings Twice, also based on a novel by James M. Cain, and it's about a doomed drifter named Frank Chambers who falls for the beautiful but dangerous Cora Smith. Frank is kind of like the poster child for this disenfranchised, lost post-war kind of man. He would have gone overseas, he would have fought in World War II, and he would have come home to a world that he didn't recognize, and it leads him to become this kind of drifter that you see in this film. Together, they hatch a grisly plan to murder Cora's husband, Nick. The novel was very risque for its time. Now, it's by 1934 standards, it was incredibly violent, very graphic sexually. These were things that people were not used to. These are things that people did not sort of talk about in polite society. It even became the subject of an obscenity trial in Boston. And because of this, it became instant bestseller. It was like super incredibly popular. It starred John Garfield and Lana Turner. This film was also remade in 1981 with Jack Nicholson and Jessica Lange. And that 1981 film is very graphic, much in line with the tone of the actual story itself. 1946 also saw The Big Sleep, starring Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, and this was based on another detective novel writer named Raymond Chandler, and in 1939 he wrote this book, The Big Sleep, and it starred Philip Marlowe. And this was another one of Bogart's detectives that made it to the screen. Both the novel and the film are famous, not just because it's Bogart and Bacall, but it was almost incoherent. The plot is so convoluted, in fact, that even the author himself, and certainly the director who made this film, nobody really knows who killed who. Bogart and Lauren Bacall were starred in this film together. It was one of a number of films they starred in together. And they starred in this together not just because they had really great on-screen chemistry, but they were also married. Those are just a few examples of some of the really great novel adaptations. But let's talk about the noir aesthetic. First of all, let's talk about lighting. And as I said, it all goes back to the kind of German expressionistic style, which you can see right here. These sharp angles and very, very crisp shadows, these swashes of bright light, and then these really dark and gritty and gloomy shadows and sort of these secret little things that are hidden in the dark that you're not supposed to see. Film noir lighting is key when you're identifying the film style. As I said, it's called low-key or chiaroscuro lighting. It hides, or at least it gives the impression that you don't see everything, because everybody always has something to hide in these stories. And so things are revealed when it's time to reveal them. We see that in the narrative, but we also see that in the visual style itself. And again, it's reflective of the many deceptions and hidden truths that are gradually revealed in film noir narratives. This hard lighting, as we just saw, creates very sharp-edged shadows, and this is achieved using props like window blinds, open doorways, street lamps, and other clever techniques. And the counter side of that is soft lighting. And so that's typically used to glamorize the female characters, particularly the femme fatale. And it's intended to emphasize their beauty and make them more alluring. So not just for us, the audience, also it helps us connect to the protagonist, the main male character, and helps us understand why he gets sort of woven into the web of deceit that the femme fatale tends to spin. So these are just some examples of hard lighting. You can see on the far left-hand side, we've got the slat from an open window blind cutting across the man's face. In the center, of course, we see the sharp light coming out of the, I don't know what that is, maybe a hotel or a police precinct or something, creating those long, dark shadows. And then on the right, of course, we see this guy who's paying one of the ultimate prices in jail. And again, we see the shadows of the bars in the bed. His face is lit up, but the rest of him is hidden in shadows. Very typical of what that hard lighting style looks like. Comparatively, we've got soft lighting. And again, it's used to sort of soften the beauty of our female characters. Not just the femme fatale, but definitely the femme fatale among others. So when we've got these kind of the lighting and we've got the sort of visual style, there are certain locations that lend itself to these kinds of aesthetics. The locations are usually, not always, but typically in cities, big cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, cities that are big, dirty, and dangerous. Now again, not every film noir film is set in the big, dangerous city of New York or Chicago, but many of them are. They're almost always dark. It's bleak, it's depressing, and if it's not bleak and depressing, just give it a while and it's gonna get bleak and depressing. A lot of these kinds of scenes take place in dirty places like alleyways, bars, and nightclubs, low-rent, skeezy little kind of cockroach apartments, and sometimes the detective's run-down office. Sometimes it's actually a nicer office. But typically these are the kind of places that maybe were once nice, not always, but sometimes they were once nice, they were once grand, but now they're run down. And again, that sort of reflects the characters themselves, how, a guy like Frank Chambers in The Postman Always Rings Twice, we can assume he was a veteran. We can assume he had a life before the war. We can assume that he saw action in World War II. So that's tragic, but it's also kind of exciting. And now he's kind of just running through the gutter. So he was also once grand, but now run down. So you can start to see how all of these elements start weaving together to help tell the story. It's not just about the words that are written in the script. It's all of these elements put together. The The Femme Fatale, again, we will talk about her in a moment. She often resides in luxurious settings, kind of counter to everything else that we see when it comes to the other kinds of characters, because this is part of what often makes her seductive, alluring, attractive. This is part of the thing that draws those guys in, because out here they've got nothing, but there with her, there's something to be gained, and all I gotta do is kill her husband or something to those extremes. And again, you can count on it not working out for everybody. Let's talk about archetypes. This is where we start talking about our male characters versus our female characters. The male protagonist, our main character, typically the person whose story we're following, this archetype, this kind of character, has remained consistent throughout the years of film noir. And again, we still see it today. These are men who are morally ambiguous. They're not necessarily bad guys, but they're not stand-up citizens either. Sometimes they are bad guys, real low-life types, the sort of guy that you would, I'd never admit to knowing, and you certainly wouldn't talk to your mom about it. They come from this gritty underworld of corruption and violence and criminal activity, and even if they don't really want to, they sort of don't really have a choice but to kind of get wrapped up in these kinds of things because that's the world they live in. Sometimes male characters were down on their luck, regular Joe types, who are just on the run and desperate for money or companionship. And again, if we're looking at a character like Frank Chambers from Postman Always Rings Twice, that's the kind of guy that we're talking about. He's not really a bad guy, but he doesn't take things very seriously. He's not very responsible. He's not really even on the run. He just doesn't have anywhere to stop. And he needs money, and he needs something to help him get by. So he sort of takes opportunities as they come to him, and then he moves on to the next. Except the story that we see unfold ends up being his last. I'm not giving away any kind of spoilers or anything because, as we heard at the beginning of this presentation, there are no happy endings. These guys are cynical, or they're obsessive. They want money. They want sex. They want power. They want freedom, to the point where they cannot see that the direction they're headed is a bad direction. These are the kind of archetypes that we see again and again and again in these kinds of films. And it's because of these weaknesses that they fall victim to the seduction of the femme fatale. She offers them what it is that they're looking for. And again, it could be sex, it could be money, it could be opportunity for power. It could just be the feeling of being able to take control of a situation and do something under their own volition. And of course, the irony is that it's not. They're being totally manipulated by the femme fatale. Just a few examples. These guys who are just down on their luck, or a private detective, or a guy who's made some choices and now is spending his time in jail, or even if you're sort of a straight-laced, well-groomed, nicely dressed, in this case, in the bottom left-hand corner, that's Walter Neff, who we talked about earlier. He's an insurance salesman. I mean, he's got a career, he's got a job, he makes good money, and he gets wrapped up because of his lust. Let's talk about the femme fatale. Of course, it means the fatal woman, and we know that it's fatal because there are no happy endings, and in the rules of film noir, it's almost always women who draw the men in to do whatever it is they want them to do. So they are, again, the female characters, not all of them, but typically the main female characters are considered a femme fatale. They are usually young and beautiful. They use their sexuality to lure these desperate men in and manipulate them to do the dirty work. And again, that dirty work is very often murder or something equally nefarious. Now, what makes the femme fatale so interesting is that you have to consider the time. Up until this time, women in film were very often depicted as the stereotypical domestic. And so the femme fatale is the overwhelming opposite. And they're dangerous and they're sexually active. They go places that polite women shouldn't go, like bars and nightclubs and speakeasies and gambling dens and things like that. And they draw these guys in because they're beautiful and they're exciting. And these are guys that are just looking for something that gives them some kind of meaning. The Femme Fatale characters, they flaunt their beauty through the use of camera angles and movement. So we'll get those long lingering shots on the beautiful eyes, or we'll get that camera pan from, the feet all the way up to her face, and we get the long legs and the thin waist and the voluptuous, everything. And it just gives you a chance to sort of soak it all in. And this is called the male gaze, this camera acting like the eyes of the male character in the film. And by extension, the audience, because we are also taking this all in for the very first time. Now, most Femme Fatale characters, there's very often a counter character. If he would just look to his other female influence in the film, he would see that's the road that's really going to get the guy where he's actually trying to go. But she's not exciting. She's not alluring. She's not voluptuous necessarily. She's not exotic. So that better companion for the male protagonist is almost always overlooked. And even if they do get noticed for what they are, it's probably too late. Some examples of our femme fatales. And again, our femme fatale is almost always beautiful. She's almost always young. She's edgy and dangerous. In our top left, we've got the dark femme fatale with the dark hair and the dark outfit. Again, skimpy for its time. To the right, we've got the blonde, and she's all dressed in white, which is a bit tricky because white's supposed to be good and black is supposed to be bad. But she's also lying on a bed. She's also exposing her legs. She's also smoking a cigarette. All of that sultry kind of body language tells us that this is a dangerous woman. On our bottom left, we've got another beautiful young woman. Again, she's dressed in what is considered by those standards a sexy sort of negligee. She's very clearly being aloof. This guy who's kind of plain looking and not the kind of guy that would typically end up with a beautiful young woman, and she's got no time of the day for him. So again, she's showing us that she's drawing this guy in and she's playing with him and toying with him. But sometimes we get a different kind of femme fatale, and it's not sexuality, but something else. Sometimes it's an opportunity for fame. Sometimes it's an opportunity for wealth. And the young, beautiful starlet element is kind of overshadowed by some of those other things, as we see with Norma Desmond here in the film Sunset Boulevard. It's one of my favorite films of all time, and it's one of my favorite film noir films because it plays with the film noir conventions, but it doesn't play with all of them by the rules. And so if you get a chance to see this film, and if you're in my film class and that's why you're watching this, you'll understand why Norma is not your typical femme fatale, but is still a femme fatale. The common rituals. Again, these are the things that happen in film noir. Let's have a look at some of these. We're often seeing characters who are wrapped up in paranoia or greed or sex or lust or love, thievery, murder, betrayal, corruption, isolation, desperation, conflicting emotions or behaviors. I should do this, but I want to do this. Immorality. You just throw all of the things, kind of the polite rules of society and culture out the window and just do whatever you want, no matter the cost, no matter who gets hurt. The deterioration of power. You get that sometimes with corrupt police or corrupt politicians. This desperate attempt at regaining control through any means necessary. And then another common ritual, something that we see very, very often, is a voiceover narration. And so that's there because many of these films are actually told in flashback. Very often our narrator is our main character and he's telling the story after the fact. So we're watching the story sort of unfold from his perspective. Iconography is the stuff that you see, and you can see it here. Everything from gambling to guns and fedoras to cigar smoke to street lamps and lipstick. These are the kinds of things that you see that says, yep, this is film noir. So there's all kinds of things that make it instantly recognizable. Cigarettes and cigarette smoke, or just smoke in general, hazy kind of locations, dark sidewalks and alleyways. The consumption of alcohol is very, very frequent in these films. The use of guns, whether it's handguns or machine guns and Tommy guns and things like that. Trench coats, fedoras, hats, ties, rain, fog, haze, or heat. If you see any of these things or some combination of these things as a scene scene is opening for you, you don't even have to know the name of the movie. You don't have to know the star. You don't have to know what year it was made. If you see these things, you can assume that you're looking at film noir. Now, interestingly, and we'll get to this in a minute, that doesn't mean it all has to be in black and white, because there are modern noir films as well. So even though the black and white and the stark contrast between light and dark is an element, you can still get that in a color film, although very often those colors are muted and the shadows are still very dark and inky. But there are modern film noir as well. It didn't just end in the 1950s. With those comes things like camera angles, and a very common one is the canted angle or a Dutch tilt. Very common in film noir. Sometimes it's kind of down low, but it also is not level. So a horizon is supposed to be perfectly level from left to right, and the Dutch angle sort of puts things off balance, and it's a psychological tool. We don't necessarily recognize it unless you know to look for it, but we feel it and experience it anyway. There's also things like low angle shots where we look up at characters, and that gives the character a sense of power, right? Whoever we're looking up at, they are above us, the viewer, and therefore they are overpowering us in some way. And sometimes there's the lower angle, which is the opposite. Mirror reflections are common because very often these stories are about duality, right? Multiple personalities, two-faced characters. So we see a lot of mirror reflection. We also see a lot of close-up shots, particularly of the Femme Fatale, but not just. And that's again to showcase her beauty and the alluring elements of her that draw us, the viewer, as well as the protagonist in. Close-up shots of male characters very often are used to sort of showcase the confined sense of being trapped that these guys are caught up in, or their conflicted emotions where they don't have room to think and to sort of make broader choices and things. And as things get tighter, things are getting worse for our character. And the long shots, when we're sort of way back and you can see a lot of what's going on, that very often reveals our location. It'll showcase the kind of landscape that we're in, but it establishes the dark, gritty world, okay? It's not just this little sliver where our character is standing. Everything you see around you is equally grim, equally dark, equally dangerous. We talked about this a little bit before, but the narratives, the way the stories themselves are told, use voiceover. And again, it's usually the voice of the male protagonist. Sometimes it's kind of an outside third omnipotent voice, but usually it's the voice of the male protagonist. And by doing so, you're using flashbacks to tell the story, so it can begin anywhere, not necessarily the beginning. And sometimes it's even non-linear. There can be twists and turns, double crosses, characters that contradict each other or themselves. The stories aren't always even told in the right order. A more common example that you might be familiar with is Pulp Fiction, which borrows its title from this kind of story, and it's a film noir in its own right. It's got our female femme fatale characters, we've got our gangsters, we've got our violence and the criminals, and we've got all of those things. It might not come off as exclusively kind of obviously film noir, but it has enough noir elements that you could classify it as such. And again, as we know from The Big Sleep, they can be very convoluted storylines. And again, it often uses dramatic irony, which means that we very often know who the killer is. We know what the character has done. We know what they're hiding from. We know the secrets that they're keeping. We know who's being manipulated. We know how they're being manipulated. We can't believe the guy in the movie doesn't realize he's being manipulated. And that's dramatic irony. Another element that's important in all film, and no less so in film noir, is the music. Because just like any music in any film, it's sort of our emotional cue. It tells us what to feel and when to feel it. It helps induce fear, suspense, the sense of unease for the audience. Sometimes it's lack of music because we expect it and then it's not there, and we don't necessarily even recognize that on a conscious level, but the fact that it's not there, which means we're not being cued, makes us feel very uneasy. The music is very seldom upbeat. and positive, although there are exceptions. Jazz is used because it tends to be sultry. It's kind of low key and minor and downbeat, but there's something sort of exotic about it. And again, it's not an upbeat, jazzy, poppy kind of thing. It's kind of low and drawn out. And as I said, silence is sometimes used for that uneasy feeling as well, because again, we lose those emotional cues. We don't know how to feel. We don't know how to connect with the characters. We don't know how to connect with the tone itself. So the music is really, really important. So we're going to wrap this up with some of the best in film noir, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the modern film noir, and that will bring our discussion to a close. Ernest Hemingway, the great author, I'm sure you have heard of him, wrote a story called The Killers, and this film is based on that book, another adaptation. And this is Burt Lancaster, who went on to become an incredibly celebrated actor. This was his first film, and he plays a character called the Swede, and he's an ex-prize fighter, and he's gotten mixed up with mobsters, and Ava Gardner plays a double-crossing woman, and he just kind of goes to his hotel room and waits because he knows that two hitmen are coming for him, and he knows that they're coming to kill him. Again, it's an adaptation of the Hemingway story of the same name, and this made both of these actors stars. It's a fantastic film. If you get a chance to see it, you really need to see it. It's outstanding. Out of the Past is another one with Robert Mitchum and Jane Greer. Kirk Douglas, who you might have heard of. Michael Douglas is his son, who played in Ant-Man. But this came out in 1947, and a small-town gas station owner is interrupted when a figure from his shady past recognizes him. He's lived this kind of life, this old life. He got away from it. He settled down. He's trying to live kind of quietly and legitimately, but his past comes back to haunt him. And then things just basically go off the rails almost completely throughout the rest of the story. And film historians consider Out of the Past a superb example of film noir because it's complicated, the storyline is very dark, the cinematography is gorgeously dark, and of course, Jane Greer sort of plays the ultimate femme fatale. In 1950, we get The Touch of Evil. Again, this is Orson Welles, Charlton Heston, Janet Leigh, who famously played Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, and Orson Welles plays Hank Quinlan. He was a good cop, but he's gone bad. He's corrupt, and he never framed anybody unless they were guilty. So he never put anybody behind bars that shouldn't have been, but he might have set things up a little bit, so guys that might otherwise have gotten away don't. I won't go into it here, but Orson Welles had a very, very, very tumultuous relationship with Hollywood. And this is one of his few films, actually, but one of his last great film. And again, it's a masterpiece of overlapping dialogue, unsettling close-ups. Remember we saw that low angle with the cop strangling the guy or putting the beating on the guy? That was from this film. There's a really great scene in the opening sequence where we know that there's a bomb in a car. And when that car is traveling, and it goes on for 3 minutes, a very long time when it comes to film narrative, getting things moving. And the anticipation is what makes that scene so pivotal. Alfred Hitchcock once said, and it applies here very, very well, knowing that there's a bomb is not what draws in the audience. It's waiting for the bomb to go off. That's what draws in the audience. And we get that perfectly in this opening scene of this film. Now, they're still making film noir today. Even though it kind of slowed down in the 1950s. In 1982, for example, the movie Blade Runner, and more recently Blade Runner 2049, which is the sequel, also film noir, uses many of the same visual styles, narrative styles, a lot of the same iconography. It's actually called tech noir because it's sort of like a futuristic version of film noir. So Rick Deckard, played by Harrison Ford, is a replicant hunter. Replicants are like androids, and his assignment is to eliminate 4 escaped replicants from the colonies who have returned to Earth. And the big mystery is Rick Deckard himself a replicant? This film is steeped in inky shadows, twisting plots. There's mystery. There's a femme fatale played by Sean Young. You can see her in the poster. It carries on all the icons, rituals, and archetypes that we associate with film noir. By design, a neo-noir, a tech noir. In 1989, Batman came out, and this was the film that kicked off what we are now still riding the wave of superhero films. It also is the film that really kind of kicked off the dark, gritty reboot, which is great for this film, not so great for some others. But this is a film by Tim Burton, who was very clearly and obviously influenced not just by film noir, but also German expressionism, where film noir borrowed its stylistic elements from. So it's kind of deeply layered that way. It's got a flawed protagonist in Batman himself. It features police corruption and government corruption, criminals and murder and revenge, and all these kinds of things that are all part of the film noir narrative style. Aesthetically, it's dark, lots of city buildings towering over you. It's gritty. This is a city that is not safe. And again, these are all essential elements of film noir. You also even see 1940s style cars and the detectives and the reporters wearing trench coats and fedoras. So some of the visual styles in costuming even reach back to film noir. So if you haven't seen Batman 1989, you really should, but don't watch it in the bright living room in the middle of the day, because it's a very dark film and it's almost impossible to see unless you're in a dark setting. LA Confidential came out in 1997. This was designed specifically to be a film noir. It doesn't just emulate sort of some of the film noir styles. It is absolutely, without apology, a modern film noir film. Again, it's got the cops, it's got murder, it's got obsessions, it's got corruption. It's set in LA. It's the early 1950s, so that time frame is toward the end of the film noir era itself. Again, it is a deliberate and successful attempt to emulate the overall aesthetic of classic noir. All of these films, if you guys get a chance to watch them, take the time to watch them. They're outstanding. And it's got a stellar cast. Kim Basinger, Kevin Spacey, whose stars kind of, lost its luster the last few years or so, but Guy Pearce, Russell Crowe, even Danny DeVito. It's fantastic. Excellent film. The Man Who Wasn't There, one of my all-time favorites. This is a film by the Coen brothers, who happen to be my favorite filmmakers of all time. It's set in the 1960s. It's about a barber, and there's murder, and then and there's insurance fraud, there's deception, and there's all of those things. It is absolutely, without question, a true noir film in style and narrative. And again, like all of these films, you really need to see it. And the most recent one that you might be familiar with, Detective Pikachu from 2019. Believe it or not, even though it's not film noir in and of itself, when we start to get introduced to the Pikachu character, we're in a room, as you can see here, and it's kind of a dark room, and there's the sharp angled shadows, and he's a detective, and even in the poster, right? It's almost like a neo-noir kind of aesthetic, similar to Blade Runner. So even though it's not a film noir film in and of itself, it actually and actively and deliberately brings in some of the elements of film noir, the things that we're already familiar with. Now that we're, 60 years down the road from when film noir really kind of found its place in cinema style, we're still seeing elements of it even now in 2019. So guys, that is our discussion about film noir. I hope you enjoyed it. As we move on, if you are just watching this for interest, this is where you should stop. If you're watching this because you're taking my film class, then get ready, because we have a few options. We may be watching The Postman Always Rings Twice, or we may be watching Double Indemnity. I kind of flip back and forth, so I don't know which one you're going to be, but you'll be one or the other. And we will also be looking at Sunset Boulevard, because it does have that unconventional femme fatale. It is a film noir film in style and narrative, and it also reaches back and touches on the transition from silent film to sound, which in our class we have recently been exploring as well. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you go out and seek more film noir.